These are the blunders, the designs that make you go, what were they thinking? This is the list of the top 10 combat handguns that shouldn't have existed. Stick around, because the history behind these is as wild as the guns themselves. And remember to hit that subscribe button and hang around for the wild ride. Alright, let's kick this off with number 10. Coming in at number 10 is the Nambu Type 94, otherwise known as the Suicide Special. That's not the kind of nickname any gun wants, but this Japanese sidearm earned it fair and square. Invented in 1934 by Kijiro Nambu, this pistol was meant to be a small, reliable weapon for the Imperial Japanese Army. Instead, it earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous handguns ever issued to soldiers, not to their enemies, but to the soldiers themselves. By the mid-1930s, Japan was rapidly expanding its military presence across most of Asia. The Imperial Army needed sidearms to arm its growing ranks, and the Type 94 was their idea of a modern pistol. Unfortunately, it was rushed into production, considering that Japan's resources and industrial quality had already been stretched thin. The consequence was a pistol that was more of a liability than an asset. The Nambu Type 94 was chambered in 8mm, a relatively weak cartridge compared to Western designs. However, the main problems lay within the design. An exposed sear would project on the side of the pistol, which, when accidentally bumped, allowed the gun to fire regardless of whether or not the trigger was pulled. Consider the prospect of holstering your weapon or simply brushing it against your equipment and having the potential for it to go off. It's not quite what you'd want in a combat zone. It had an awkward, cumbersome grip and was fitted with a short barrel, making it wildly inaccurate. Soldiers reportedly hated carrying it. Later war models were fabricated so poorly that they looked like props from a low-budget movie rather than real firearms. The nickname Suicide Special was a grim reflection of the fact that the gun was almost as dangerous to its user as it was to the enemy. Modern handguns are fitted with safety features that virtually eliminate the possibility of accidental discharge. Either trigger safeties, like the Glock's Safe Action System, or external manual safeties ensure that modern handguns fire only when they're supposed to. Modern semi-auto pistols also come chambered in more effective calibers, such as 9mm, that balance stopping power with recoil control. Flaw design notwithstanding, about 70,000 Type 94s were made. Nowadays, these firearms are for collectors and are valued more for their historical appeal than functionality. The Nambu Type 94 reminds us of what happens when you compromise on practicality and safety for speed and cost-cutting. It's a gun that has gone down in history, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale. Coming in at number 9 is a Colt revolving rifle, a weapon that tried to combine the best aspects of revolvers and rifles, but was quite explosive. This rifle came in the middle of the 19th century from Colt's patent firearms manufacturing company, an ambitious undertaking to create a repeating long gun. The sad truth is that it became infamous for its dangerous kinks. The 1850s were pretty much an innovative decade for firearms. Riding high on the success of his revolvers, Samuel Colt decided to upscale the concept for use in rifles. The idea was to give soldiers a long gun that could fire multiple shots without reloading, which was a revolutionary concept at that time. The U.S. Army even adopted it during the Civil War. But as the soldiers soon discovered, bigger isn't always better. A major critical design flaw in the Colt revolving rifle was chain firing. That happened when hot gases from firing one chamber would accidentally ignite the powder in adjacent chambers, causing multiple rounds to fire at once. Just try to imagine holding a rifle when 3 or 4 barrels go off simultaneously right next to your hand. That's less of a weapon and more of a personal fireworks display. This made handling the rifle clumsy and uncomfortable, as soldiers were encouraged to keep the offhand far back from the cylinder to avoid losing fingers. It was also prone to jamming and fouling and required regular cleaning. Add the weight and bulkiness to it, and you have a weapon that becomes more headache than it's worth. To curb this, modern revolvers and rifles now have sealed firing mechanisms, eliminating the risk of chain fires. Like those on the Nagant M1895, gas sealing systems were direct innovations to address leakage issues in earlier firearms. Additionally, ergonomic designs ensure better handling and safety. Not more than 4,400 Colt revolving rifles were produced before they were eventually phased out after the Civil War. It's now one collector's gun, and evidence that sometimes an idea, though revolutionary as it appears, is never really worth advocating for. After its historical minute in the spotlight, the Colt revolving rifle was remembered more for what it lacked than for what it improved. Coming in at number 8, the FP-45 Liberator has a history that's almost too wild to believe. Conceived during the Second World War, this single-shot pistol was designed to equip resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied territory. Its stated objective was to spread chaos and panic among enemy ranks, but in action, it caused a lot more frustration than anything else. The early 1940s were a bleak time for the Allies. With most of Europe under Nazi occupation, the idea of airdropping simplistic, disposable firearms into occupied territory seemed almost brilliant. Then came the FP-45 Liberator, a single-shot pistol that cost a mere $2.40 to make and could be easily produced en masse. A very bold concept, but not so desirable in execution. The Liberator was chambered in 45 ACP, a heavy round for such a small, cheaply made gun. The frame was snapped sheet metal with a barrel and firing pin. The barrel was smooth bore, so accuracy was nil. Anything hit much beyond a few feet was a matter of luck rather than skill. Reloading was a nightmare. The spent casing had to be pushed out with a wooden dowel immediately after firing, and then another round had to be loaded manually. When things get hot, this is impractical to the point of absurdity. The best value resistance fighters got out of the Liberator was being a psychological weapon. Sometimes, the presence of one was all it took to intimidate. But as a functional firearm, not so much. More than 1 million FP-45 Liberators were produced but never used. Many were melted down for scrap metal after the war. Today, the Liberator is an intriguing artifact from history, representing both ingenuity and desperation in equal measure. While it didn't live up to its intended purpose, it remains a curious relic of World War II's more unconventional strategies. Coming in at number 7 is the infamous Chauchat light machine gun, a weapon so problematic that soldiers often preferred going into combat without it. Developed for use by the French in the First World War, the Chauchat was designed to deliver mobile firepower for trench warfare. In practice, however, it became little more than the poster child for bad guns. World War I was a brutal conflict, with fighting in trenches and across fields under some of the worst conditions imaginable. The French army desperately needed a light machine gun to complement their infantry. The Chauchat seemed like the perfect solution at the time, being cheap to produce, relatively lightweight, and capable of automatic fire, which is a pity because the devil was in the details. It was chambered in 8mm Lebel, which was a potent round for the time. That sounded pretty good, but that open-sided magazine design just invited dirt, mud, and other debris into the interior of the Chauchat, where they promptly clogged the works. And in the muck of the trenches of World War I, that was a recipe for disaster. Soldiers reported frequent jams, misfires, and even catastrophic failures that rendered the gun useless. Also, recoil became an issue. The long recoil system made the gun hard to control, which the flimsy bipod did not help with. U.S. troops that were issued Chauchats in 30-06 Springfield found it even worse, because the design was not properly adapted for the new cartridge. Many simply dished Chauchat in favor of more reliable firearms. So, modern machine guns, like the M249 SAW, have enclosed magazines or belt-fed systems that protect ammunition from debris, while recoil management has been significantly improved through more sophisticated gas-operated systems, resulting in more stable and reliable fire. More than 250,000 Chauchats were produced, and while they were far from perfect, they did see wide usage during the war. Today, the Chauchat enjoys the dubious distinction of being remembered as perhaps the worst light machine gun ever built. A testament to the perils of wartime production, it served as a reminder that sometimes the latest and greatest idea doesn't quite pan out. Coming in at number 6, the Gyrojet Pistol fired miniature rockets instead of traditional bullets. It sounded like something out of a James Bond movie, and honestly, it just looked the part. It was cool. However, the Gyrojet turned out to be little more than a novelty of a weapon. The 1960s were a time of space-age innovation, and MBA associates aimed to bring that sense of innovation into the world of firearms. The Gyrojet fired rocket-propelled ammunition that continued to accelerate after clearing the barrel, providing high velocity with theoretically minimal recoil. It was designed for both military and special operations use. However, its very significant drawbacks were quickly evident. Its biggest weakness was its unreliability. The rockets needed a little distance to reach maximum speed, making them nearly impossible to use in close combat. Meanwhile, they lacked accuracy and punch compared to conventional bullets, making them inefficient for long-distance use. Reloads were clumsy, ammunition was expensive and difficult to manufacture. The gun was designed fashionably for the future, but its mechanical problems overrode aesthetics. It was highly impractical for any soldier or cop who ever used it, and it was soon dismissed as a viable option. Less than 1,000 Gyrojet pistols were ever made. These days, they're a collector's item. The idea was famous, but the actual product fell well short. The Gyrojet does have its place in firearms history, however, as evidence that not every idea that is proposed is a good one. At number 5 is the Sten Mk II, but not the vanilla version you're used to. No, we're talking about the improvised versions made in back alley workshops and basements during World War II. While the original Sten was pretty much a no-nonsense, stripped-down sort of submachine gun, the various homemade versions took the concept of simplicity to a whole new and often hazardous extreme. During the early 1940s, Britain was in the worst state imaginable. With threats from virtually every angle, Britain needed a gun that would be both inexpensive and simple to manufacture. So the Sten was created to arm soldiers and resistance fighters quickly. While the factory-produced versions of the original were serviceable, the improvised ones, well, let's just say they had character. Improvised Stens were built from whatever was available, and quality control was more of a suggestion than a rule. According to soldiers, they would often jam, misfire, or simply fall apart. One particularly infamous quirk was their tendency to fire accidentally if dropped, or even bump too hard. Imagine carrying a gun that could go off just from being jostled in a crowded trench. Yikes. The guns were unsafe for both the enemy and the user, for the safety mechanisms never existed. Because of the improvisation, the tolerances would be wrong, so the performance was very spotty. With its crude appearance, it felt like a hurried science project. Now, despite their flaws, the Sten, improvised versions included, played a crucial role in arming British troops and resistance fighters in occupied territories. They stand as examples of human ingenuity at work under pressure, even when they weren't the safest or most reliable. Today, these improvised Stens show how necessity can breed creativity, and why proper engineering can take quite some time. So, if you ever see one in a museum, think about the ingenuity, even though it's not exactly what you would want in your arsenal. Coming in at number 4, we have the Mars Automatic Pistol, a gun that tried to do it all and ended up doing none of it well. It's like that overachiever friend who always bites off more than he can chew and leaves a trail of destruction everywhere. This semi-auto pistol from the early 20th century was going to change the world, but ended up being a cautionary tale. The early 1900s were exciting times for innovative firearms. Revolvers remained the kings, but semi-automatic pistols were starting to make waves. Hugh Gabbett Fairfax wanted the Mars to be the most powerful semi-auto pistol in the world. Spoiler alert, he succeeded, but at a cost nobody was willing to pay. The Mars fired monstrous cartridges, like the .45 Mars Long, powerful enough that the recoil was reportedly strong enough to dislocate the wrists of those who tested the thing. You can only imagine pulling the trigger on a gun that punishes you more than your target. Not exactly practical for combat. It was also a freakishly complicated gun, with a weird loading mechanism that was just begging to be jammed. But its overweight, blocky design didn't exactly make things much better either. It was heavy, awkward, and about as user-friendly as a medieval catapult. Military forces tested it and quickly decided they'd rather stick with revolvers. Only about 80 Mars pistols were ever made, making them a rare collector's item today. But they're an interesting piece of history and a good example of how bigger is not always better. While the Mars automatic pistol reached for the stars, it would end up being a prime example of how ambition without practicality can backfire. Coming in at number 3 is the Dardick 1500, a gun that tried to combine revolvers and semi-autos into one futuristic package. It was the 1950s, and everyone was dreaming of innovation. The Dardick 1500 turned out to be a little too ahead of its time, or just a bad idea in general. Space-age design and technological breakthroughs dominated the 1950s. The thing that would finally revolutionize firearms was a very unique concept: trounds, or triangular rounds. These unusual cartridges were easy to manufacture and reload, and he constructed the Dardick 1500 to fire them. I mean, the gun looks like it belongs in a collection of tools used to assemble IKEA furniture rather than as a weapon. The Dardick 1500's open-cylinder design easily let in dirt, dust, and jamming. The rounds themselves were fragile and inconsistent, more likely to crack under pressure. Reloading was clunky, and the gun's awkward shape didn't exactly inspire confidence. Not to mention, the Dardick 1500 wasn't much to look at. It was square, plain, and utilitarian, which might have passed it off as some sort of prototype rather than a finished product. And while it could switch between semi-auto and revolver modes, neither function worked particularly well. Law enforcement and civilians alike took one look and said, no thanks. Fewer than 100 Dardick 1500s were ever made, and they quickly faded into obscurity. Today, they're a curiosity for collectors and a reminder that not every innovation is destined for success. The Dardick 1500 may not have changed the world, but it sure makes for a good conversation piece at gun shows. Coming in at number 2, the Nock Volley Gun at least packs 7 barrels into a single firearm, to say nothing of overkill. Designed for the British Royal Navy in the late 18th century, the Nock was supposed to clear enemy decks during boarding actions. Instead, it became infamous for its impracticality. The late 1700s were a period of exceptionally bitter and cutthroat naval fighting, and the British sought a weapon to give them a real edge. The idea of firing 7 barrels simultaneously to wipe out groups of enemies sounded great on paper until they tried it. The 7 barrels of the Nock Volley Gun produced massive recoil, and the shooter would often get injured in the process. Reloading all those barrels was slow and cumbersome, something you don't want when in the heat of battle. If that wasn't enough, its intense muzzle flash had a knack for setting sails on fire, most likely not something you want during a naval skirmish. Another problem was its weight. The Nock was heavy and clumsy to aim. It was also expensive to manufacture, so only a small number were ever made. Most sailors preferred something a little simpler and a lot more reliable. The Nock Volley Gun was retired quickly, but lives on in pop culture. You may recognize it from The Patriot, where it appeared as an impractically dramatic weapon. Today, it's a fascinating relic of a time when bigger was thought to be better, even when it wasn't. And finally, taking the top spot is the LeMat Revolver, a gun that tried to be both a revolver and a shotgun, but ended up being neither. This Civil War-era weapon was as ambitious as it was very impractical, but the story is as wild as its design. The LeMat Revolver was created in the 1850s by Jean-Alexandre LeMat, a French-American with big ideas. It had a 9-shot cylinder chambered in .42 caliber with a secondary barrel underneath for a single 16-gauge shotgun round. Confederate officers loved the concept, and it saw action during the limited use of the Civil War period. The notion of having a combined revolver and shotgun does sound cool, but the actual execution was clunky. The gun was heavy, awkward to handle, and required flipping a lever to switch between the two modes, something you wouldn't want to fiddle with in the middle of a firefight. The LeMat was also plagued with reliability issues. The gun misfired frequently, and due to its complexity of design, it was a pain to maintain. Soldiers who used it probably spent more time repairing than firing. Flaws aside, the LeMat remains one of the most iconic firearms ever produced. Being a favorite among collectors, it's also found its place in a few pop culture expressions, with Red Dead Redemption and Django Unchained probably being the best examples. It's not the most practical combat handgun, but certainly one of the most memorable. Well, there you have it, friends. 10 of the most questionably designed guns to have ever seen the light of day. Which do you think wins the prize for the biggest screw-up? Now hang on, the next video is right around the corner, and this is definitely something that you wouldn't want to miss. See you next time.